The gravel crunched beneath the tires as we pulled into the driveway of the cabin, the towering pines casting long shadows across the sunlit path. I leaned forward, peering through the windshield as the cabin came into view. 2 stories of rustic wood and stone, perched neatly by the edge of a shimmering lake. A gentle mist hovered over the water, reflecting the afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds. "Dad should be here somewhere," my friend muttered, cutting the engine. "He's probably out back chopping wood or something." I stepped out, stretching my legs from the long drive, the crisp air filling my lungs. It was quiet, eerily so, like the world had been muted just for us. The only sound was the distant call of birds and the soft ripple of water against the dock. A low rumble of footsteps broke the silence, and I turned to see him. His father stepped around the side of the cabin, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was taller than I remembered, broad-shouldered and rugged, his hair streaked with silver at the temples. His jaw was sharp, dusted with stubble that caught the light, and his eyes— God, his eyes were the color of steel, piercing and unyielding. "Well, look who finally made it," he called out, his voice deep and warm. He crossed the distance with steady strides, the kind of confidence that comes with age and experience. "Hey, Dad," my friend called back, waving. "This is my buddy I told you about." I stepped forward, offering my hand. "Nice to meet you, sir." He took my hand, his grip firm and unyielding. His palm was rough, calloused from work, and I felt the strength behind it. His eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to slow. His gaze was sharp, assessing, and I couldn't look away. "Call me Mark," he said finally, releasing my hand, but not his gaze. His smile was slight, almost unreadable. "You boys have a good drive?" "Yeah, smooth enough," I replied, shifting under his stare. "Good," he nodded, turning his attention back to my friend. "I've got the spare room set up. You can take your pick." We hauled our bags from the car and followed him inside. The cabin was even more beautiful up close. Wood-paneled walls, leather chairs by the fireplace, and windows that stretched wide to let in the view of the lake. The place was immaculate, well kept with a sense of warmth that didn't quite match its grandeur. "Your room's down the hall to the left," Mark said, pointing. His eyes flickered to mine again, a glance that was almost imperceptible. I nodded, brushing it off as simple courtesy, but the flutter in my stomach didn't quite settle. We each unpacked in our rooms, the stillness of the cabin wrapping around me like a blanket. I ran my hands over the wooden dresser, glancing out, the window where the sun was setting over the lake, casting streaks of gold across the water. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. There was something charged in the air, a hum of electricity that I couldn't shake. I thought back to the handshake, the firm grip of his hand and the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the window. I tried to brush it off, tried to tell myself that I was imagining things. But when I stepped back into the hallway and caught Mark's gaze from across the living room, standing there with a towel over his shoulder and a knowing smirk on his lips, I knew I wasn't imagining anything at all. My heart thudded in my chest, and I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. His eyes didn't waver, didn't blink. Just watched. I turned away quickly, heading back to my room to compose myself, but I could feel it, the weight of his gaze, lingering long after I closed the door behind me. The scent of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread filled the cabin, wrapping around us like a warm blanket. The dining table, set with simple plates and thick glasses, glowed under the soft light of the overhead lamp. Mark carved the chicken with steady hands, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the strength in his forearms. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help but notice the way his muscles flexed with each precise cut. "Hope you're hungry," he said, looking up with a grin. "I tend to cook for an army, even when it's just the 3 of us." I chuckled, taking the plate he handed me. "You won't hear me complaining." My friend dug in immediately, piling his plate high. Mark watched him with a smirk before turning to me. "What about you? Big appetite?" I nodded, shoveling a generous helping onto my plate. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." "Good," Mark replied, his eyes lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. It sent a ripple of heat up my spine. Dinner was easy, surprisingly so. Mark was charming in a way I hadn't expected, effortlessly cracking jokes that made us both laugh. He told stories from his youth, about getting into trouble with his brothers, sneaking into concerts, and the time he almost got arrested for accidentally wandering onto private property during a hike. I laughed harder than I'd laughed in months. The kind of laugh that shook your shoulders and left you breathless. "You're way too good at telling stories," I said, wiping tears from the corners of my eyes. Mark just smiled, leaning back in his chair with that same air of confidence. "Well, some things get better with age." His eyes caught mine, and for a heartbeat, everything around us seemed to still. I cleared my throat, breaking the spell. "I'm gonna grab some more water," I said, pushing my chair back. "Whiskey's better," Mark replied smoothly, already standing and heading toward the living room. He gestured for me to follow, and I hesitated just a moment before doing so. The living room was warm and inviting, the stone fireplace casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. The fire crackled, sending soft pops of embers up the chimney. Mark reached for a bottle of whiskey on the shelf, pouring 2 glasses without asking if I wanted one. He handed me the glass, his fingers brushing mine. A brief touch, but enough to send a current through my skin. "To good company," he said, raising his glass. I mirrored him. "To good company." We sipped, the whiskey smooth and warm, burning slightly as it settled in my stomach. My friend's voice drifted in from the kitchen. "I've got to make a call, won't be long," he shouted. "Take your time," Mark replied, not taking his eyes off me, and just like that, we were alone. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Mark took another sip of whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. "So," he began, voice softer now, "what is it you want out of life?" I blinked, the question catching me off guard. "That's big," I said, laughing nervously. "I don't know. Stability, maybe? Something that feels right." He nodded thoughtfully, swirling the liquid in his glass. "I get that. Took me years to figure out what I wanted. Sometimes I still don't know." I studied him. Really studied him. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the strength in his jaw, the faint sprinkle of gray in his hair. There was a softness there, hidden beneath the ruggedness. Vulnerability, in the way his gaze drifted to the fire, lost in thought. "And what about you?" I asked, voice low. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Mark's eyes flicked back to mine, and the firelight danced in his gaze. "Not yet," he said quietly, voice almost a whisper. "But I'm working on it." I swallowed, the room growing warmer by the second. I was about to say something. Anything. To cut through the tension, when my friend stepped back into the room, the sound of his footsteps snapping us both back to reality. "Sorry. That took forever," he said, flopping onto the couch with a sigh. Mark straightened, the guarded expression returning like a mask. "No worries. We were just talking," he replied smoothly, lifting his glass. But I saw it, that brief flicker of something real in his eyes, and I knew he'd seen it in mine too. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. The cabin was silent, save for the soft creak of the wooden beams settling into the night. I woke up parched, my mouth dry, and realized I'd forgotten to bring a bottle of water into my room. The moonlight slipped through the window, painting long, silvery lines across the floor. I rubbed my eyes and swung my legs over the edge of the bed, trying not to wake my friend in the next room. I padded down the hallway, the chill of the floorboards seeping through my socks. The cabin felt different at night, more intimate somehow, like the darkness had pressed in closer, leaving only the faint glow from the windows and the embers still smoldering in the fireplace. Reaching the kitchen, I fumbled around for a glass, grateful when I finally found one in the dark. I filled it with cool water from the tap, the quiet rush breaking the stillness. As I took a sip, I couldn't help but think about earlier, about the way Mark had looked at me, his eyes so intense it made my chest feel tight. I tried to shake the thought, reminding myself that it was just my imagination, that there was no way he could actually be interested. But I couldn't quite convince myself. I finished the water, set the glass in the sink, and turned to head back to my room. As I stepped into the hallway, I nearly collided with a solid, warm figure. "Oh," I stammered, stepping back quickly. Mark stood there, shirtless, a white towel slung low on his hips, droplets of water still clinging to his bare chest. His hair was damp, falling messily across his forehead, and the scent of soap and cedar clung to his skin. My gaze involuntarily traced the defined lines of his torso, the way the muscles rippled with each slow breath. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, a low chuckle in his voice. I swallowed hard, trying not to let my eyes linger on the way a single drop of water traced a line down his collarbone before disappearing into the towel. Just getting some water." He leaned against the door frame, arms folding across, his chest, his biceps flexing. "Couldn't sleep?" "Yeah," I managed, cursing the way my voice cracked. "Guess I'm not used to the quiet out here." His lips quirked up, almost a smirk. "Takes some getting used to. You looked like you were enjoying yourself earlier, at dinner." "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Your cooking was great." His eyes softened, but his smirk didn't fade. "Glad you liked it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hallway felt impossibly narrow, his presence taking up more space than seemed possible. I couldn't move, could barely think. The way his gaze raked over me, taking me in, made my pulse hammer in my ears. He didn't move, just stayed leaning against the frame, eyes locked on mine. "You okay?" he asked, voice quieter now, almost teasing. "Yeah," I blurted out too quickly. "Just tired. Long drive." He nodded, a hint of something knowing glinting in his eyes. "Yeah, long day." I shifted awkwardly, trying to move past him, without brushing against his bare skin. As I did, his hand came up, catching my shoulder briefly. My heart thudded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Hey," he murmured, his voice soft now. "If you need anything, just knock. I'm a light sleeper." I couldn't find words, just nodded, and his hand dropped away. I squeezed past him, careful not to make contact, but even the warmth radiating from his body made my skin tingle. Before I could take more than a step, I heard him chuckle lowly behind me. "Good night," he said, the hint of a smirk still in his tone. "Good night," I mumbled, not daring to look back. Once I was in my room, I shut the door and leaned against it, exhaling shakily. My heart wouldn't slow down, and my hands trembled as I ran them through my hair. I couldn't stop replaying it, the way his hand felt on my shoulder, the look in his eyes, the way he seemed completely unfazed while I stood there practically unraveling. I pressed my palm to my chest, feeling the rapid thudding there, and took a deep breath. It didn't help. I couldn't get his face out of my mind, or the way he'd looked at me, like he could see right through me. I crawled back, into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep was a long way off, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All I could think about was the way his skin glistened in the moonlight, and the look in his eyes when he'd said goodnight. The sunlight poured through the windows the next morning, waking me earlier than I'd planned. I groaned, rubbing my eyes and stretching my stiff limbs. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. I slipped out of bed, threw on some sweats, and padded out into the hallway. My friend was already up, shoes laced, backpack slung over one shoulder. He gave me a quick nod. "Heading into town to grab some supplies. You good here with Dad?" I blinked, still groggy. Yeah, I'm good." "Cool. Shouldn't be more than a couple hours. Try not to let him bore you to death," he joked, before heading out the door. I watched as his car disappeared down the gravel drive, the dust lingering in its wake. The silence settled back in. I turned to find Mark leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Guess it's just you and me," he said. I tried not to let my face flush. "Looks like it." Mark pushed off the frame, hands slipping into his pockets. "What do you say we make the most of it? There's a hiking trail just behind the cabin. It's a bit of a climb, but the view's worth it." I hesitated, glancing at the towering pines outside. "I don't know." "Come on," he coaxed, his voice softening just a bit. "What else are you gonna do? Sit around and wait?" I sighed, unable to argue. "All right, fine. Let me grab my shoes." The trail wound through dense clusters of trees, the sunlight filtering down in fractured beams, casting shadows that danced across the forest floor. Mark led the way, moving with a confidence that belied the steep incline. I followed, struggling to keep up at first, but eventually finding my rhythm. "Been coming up here since I was a kid," Mark called over his shoulder. His voice carried easily through the quiet of the woods. "My dad used to take me out here every summer. Said it was the only place he could think straight." I stepped over a fallen branch, ducking beneath a low-hanging limb. "Did it work?" I asked, half out of breath. Mark chuckled, slowing his pace to let me catch up. "Sometimes. Most of the time, he just came back with a bottle of whiskey and a bad attitude." I raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you've got some stories," he smirked. "More than I can count. Maybe I'll tell you some if you can keep up." I took that as a challenge, picking up my pace. Mark watched me with approval, a grin stretching across his face as I caught up beside him. "That's the spirit," he said, clapping me on the back, his hand lingering a second too long before slipping away. We walked for another half-hour, talking about everything and nothing. Mark shared bits and pieces of his life. How he used to race motorcycles in his 20s. How he once broke his arm trying to fix the roof of the cabin by himself. There was something raw in the way he spoke, unguarded, like he didn't care if I saw the cracks. "And you?" he asked finally, glancing over. "What are you running from?" I faltered, nearly tripping over a stray root. "What makes you think I'm running?" He stopped, turning to face me fully. The sunlight dappled across his face, highlighting the lines around his eyes and the flecks of silver in his hair. "Everyone's running from something," he said quietly. "Even out here. Especially out here." I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. He just smiled knowingly, like he already had his answer, and turned back to the trail. The final stretch was brutal, the incline steeper than before. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged bursts, but Mark pressed on like he'd done it 1,000 times. I forced myself to follow, determined not to fall behind. When we finally reached the summit, I stopped dead in my tracks, breathless, not just from the climb, but from the view. The lake stretched out far below us, its surface shimmering under the midday sun. Mountains framed the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. The air was thinner up here, sharper, clearer. Mark stepped up beside me, his shoulder brushing mine, as he looked out over the landscape. "Told you it was worth it," he said, his voice softer now. "Yeah," I breathed. "You weren't kidding." We stood there, shoulder to shoulder, neither of us speaking. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, the way his breath rose and fell beside me. He reached out, his hand brushing my shoulder lightly. It was gentle, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I turned to look at him, but he was already facing the horizon, his hand slipping away like it had never been there at all. "We should head back," he said, voice steady, betraying nothing. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his touch, the way it lingered, even now, as we turned back down the trail. The sky darkened faster than I expected. Heavy clouds rolled in over the lake, casting shadows across the water, and a chill settled into the air. Mark looked up, squinting at the horizon. "We should head back," he said, his voice low and serious. I followed his gaze, watching as streaks of lightning split the sky, followed closely by the low rumble of thunder. "Yeah," I agreed, my voice barely audible over the growing wind. We made our way back down the trail, faster this time, the path slick with mud and scattered leaves. Rain started to fall in fat droplets, splattering against the canopy above, then cascading down in heavy sheets. By the time the cabin came into view, we were drenched, our clothes sticking to our skin. Mark fumbled with the key, finally shoving the door open and ushering me inside. I stepped over the threshold, shivering as the warmth of the cabin wrapped around me. Mark followed, closing the door behind him just as a crack of thunder shook the windows. "Hang tight," he said, stripping off his soaked flannel shirt and tossing it over a chair. "I'll get a fire going." I watched him move with practiced ease, stacking logs in the stone fireplace, his hands steady and sure. The flames caught quickly, crackling to life and spreading warmth through the room. I stood there, still dripping, not sure what to do with myself. "You're gonna catch a cold like that," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Towels are in the closet down the hall." I nodded, peeling off my jacket and hanging it by the door. I found the towels easily enough, wrapping one around my shoulders before heading back to the living room. Mark had settled onto the leather couch, his feet kicked up on the table, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses in front of him. "Thought you could use this," he said, nodding to the glass. I hesitated for only a second before sitting across from him, reaching for the drink. The whiskey was warm, smooth, spreading heat through my chest and pushing back the chill. I leaned back, listening to the rain beat against the windows, the fire crackling softly between us. The silence stretched, comfortable but heavy. Finally, Mark spoke. "You always this quiet?" I looked up, surprised by the question. "I guess so," I replied. "Depends on the company." He raised an eyebrow, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "I'm not that intimidating, am I?" I smiled. "I don't know. A little, maybe." He chuckled, shaking his head. "That's a new one. Most people say, I'm too talkative." We both laughed, the sound oddly soothing against the backdrop of the storm. Another crack of thunder rolled through, and the lights flickered once before holding steady. Mark leaned back, stretching his arms along the back of the couch. "It gets lonely out here," he said finally, his voice softer now. "Especially since the divorce." I glanced up, caught off guard by his openness. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. He waved it off, but his eyes were distant, focused somewhere beyond the rain-streaked windows. "It is what it is. Some things just don't work out, no matter how hard you try." He looked back at me, his gaze sharp and unsettlingly honest. "You ever feel that way?" I hesitated, fingers tightening around the glass. "Yeah," I admitted, the word slipping out before I could stop it. "More often than I'd like." He studied me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't seem like the type to hold back," he said. I scoffed, shaking my head. "I'm better at it than you think." Mark sat, his glass down on the table, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "Why?" I swallowed hard, the warmth of the whiskey doing nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. "Because—" I hesitated, the words clawing at my throat, desperate to be spoken. "Because I'm still figuring out who I am." The confession hung between us, raw and unpolished. Mark didn't look away. He didn't flinch or shift uncomfortably. He just sat there, waiting for me to continue. I took a breath, the words spilling out faster than I intended. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living 2 different lives. The person I am and the person I'm supposed to be. And it's hard. Hard to know which one is real." He nodded slowly, his gaze never faltering. "I get that," he said, voice barely above, a whisper. "I really do." A silence settled, heavy and charged. The fire crackled, the rain pounded against the glass, but inside it felt like the world had stopped. Mark reached out then, his hand finding my shoulder. His grip was firm, reassuring, but the warmth of his touch sent a current through me, sparking heat beneath my skin. "Whatever you're figuring out," he murmured, his voice steady, "you don't have to do it alone." I looked up, our eyes locking across the small space between us. His hand lingered, just long enough to be noticed, before slipping away. But the warmth stayed, spreading through me like a slow burn, unraveling the knots I hadn't realized were there. Thunder rolled again, but it sounded distant, like it belonged to another world entirely. The fire had burned low, the logs reduced to glowing embers that pulsed softly in the dimness. Shadows flickered across the walls, stretching and curling like whispers of something unspoken. The rain had slowed, now just a soft patter against the windows, a gentle rhythm that filled the silence between us. We hadn't moved from the living room. Both of us settled deep into the leather couches, whiskey glasses resting empty on the table between us. Our conversation had drifted, growing softer, more intimate. Small confessions and half-spoken thoughts, stripped bare by the glow of the fire. Mark leaned back, stretching his arms along the back of the couch, his gaze fixed on the embers. I watched him from the corner of my eye, trying not to be obvious. But I knew I was failing. He turned his head, catching me, and I didn't look away. His eyes softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You keep looking at me like that," he said, voice low and rough, "and I'm gonna start thinking you want something." My heart skipped, hammering hard in my chest. I swallowed, trying to find words, but nothing came. The room felt impossibly warm, the fire crackling softly, shadows flickering across his face, catching in the silver of his hair and the rough lines of his jaw. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving mine. "Am I wrong?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck, tangled in my throat. My hands were trembling, and I gripped my knees to steady them. He waited, patient and unblinking, like he could outlast any silence. Finally, I shook my head. "You're not wrong," I whispered, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath, and leaned back again, his arms stretching across the back of the couch. Closer this time. His fingertips grazed my shoulder, the touch barely there, but it sent a shiver through me. I looked up, meeting his gaze head-on. His eyes were softer now, heavy-lidded, and intent, searching my face for something I couldn't name. He lifted his hand, brushing his thumb gently across my cheek, the roughness of his skin startling against mine. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The world narrowed to just this. His hand on my face, his eyes locked on mine. The fire casting, shadows that danced and flickered around us. There was a pause, stretched tight and humming with electricity. His thumb lingered just beneath my cheekbone, his eyes dropping to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then I moved. It wasn't planned, wasn't thought out. It was instinctive, a need that eclipsed everything else. I leaned forward, closing the space between us, my lips brushing his, soft at first, testing. He didn't pull back. He didn't hesitate. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss. It was slow, unhurried, like we had all the time in the world, like the storm outside had stopped just for us. His lips were warm and sure, his breath mixing with mine as the room blurred around us. I didn't know how long it lasted, seconds, minutes, maybe more. Time felt irrelevant, suspended in that moment. His hand tangled in my hair, mine clutched, the edge of the couch, desperate for something solid. Then headlights cut through the window, sweeping across the walls, the gravel crunching loudly outside. We broke apart instantly, the room crashing back into focus. My breath came fast and shallow, my heart still hammering wildly in my chest. Mark's hand fell away, his gaze dropping to the floor, jaw clenched. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. The weight of what had just happened hung between us, heavy and unspoken. I straightened, smoothing out my shirt with shaky hands as the sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. Mark stood, rubbing the back of his neck. "We should—" He paused, searching for words. "We should get out there. Help him with the bags." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. He didn't look at me as he headed for the door, pulling it open just as my friend stepped onto the porch, waving cheerfully through the rain. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to steady before following him out. The air was cool and sharp against my skin, chasing away the warmth that still lingered from the kiss. But even as we moved into the cold, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop feeling the weight of his hand on my cheek, the taste of his mouth, the way everything had slipped away in that single, perfect moment. And I knew, without a doubt, that there was no going back now. The sun crept over the tops of the pines, stretching long fingers of light across the gravel driveway. The air was still damp from last night's storm, the leaves glistening with droplets that shimmered in the morning sun. I stood by the trunk of the car, my bag slung over my shoulder, watching as my friend loaded the last of his things, his energy impossibly cheerful for so early in the morning. "Man, that was a hell of a weekend," he said, slamming the trunk shut. With a grin. "I forgot how much I missed this place." "Yeah," I replied, my voice softer. "It was something." He didn't seem to notice the weight in my tone, too busy checking the cooler in the back seat and fiddling with his phone. My eyes drifted back to the cabin, its wooden frame bathed in morning light, smoke still curling gently from the chimney. It looked peaceful, untouched, like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But I knew better. I heard the front door creak open, and Mark stepped out onto the porch. He was dressed simply, just a plain t-shirt and jeans, but he looked different, softer almost. His eyes found mine, and I couldn't look away. "Need any help?" he called out, his voice carrying easily across the driveway. "Nah, we're all set," my friend answered, oblivious as he jammed his backpack into the back seat. Mark walked over anyway, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his gaze shifting briefly to his son before landing back on me. "Good to have you out. Here," he said, voice steady. "Hope you'll come back sometime." My throat tightened, but I forced a nod. "Yeah, I'd like that." His eyes held mine, something unspoken lingering there, heavy and electric. My friend shut the car door with a loud thud, shattering the silence. He looked up, flashing Mark a grin. "Thanks for everything, Dad. I'll text you when we get back." Mark smiled, reaching out to clap him on the back. "Drive safe," he said simply. "And try not to get any tickets this time, huh?" My friend laughed, rolling his eyes as he climbed into the driver's seat. I stood there for a moment, rooted in place, my bag still hanging off my shoulder. Mark stepped closer, extending his hand. I took it, his grip firm and warm, lingering just a bit longer than necessary. His thumb brushed the inside of my wrist, an almost imperceptible touch, but enough to make my breath hitch. His eyes locked on mine, and before I could say anything, he pressed a small piece of paper into my hand, folding my fingers over it. "Take care of yourself," he murmured, voice low enough that only I could hear. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He squeezed my hand one last time before letting go, stepping back as if nothing had happened. I climbed into the passenger seat, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. My friend started the engine, the car rumbling to life as he adjusted the mirrors. "Ready?" he asked, oblivious to the storm raging beneath my skin. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely audible. "I'm ready." We pulled out of the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, sending small clouds of dust spiraling up behind us. I kept my eyes forward, hands clenched in my lap. But as we turned the bend, I couldn't help myself. I glanced back. Mark stood there, hands in his pockets, watching us leave. His gaze never wavered, even as the car gained distance, his silhouette framed perfectly by the morning sun. My chest tightened, and I turned back around, swallowing hard. I looked down at my hand, still clenched around the folded paper. I waited until my friend was busy adjusting the radio before I opened it. It was simple, just a phone number, scrawled in neat handwriting. Beneath it, a single word. Soon. My heart leapt, pounding against my ribs, and I folded the paper back, up, tucking it safely into my pocket. I leaned back against the seat, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but my mind was still back there. Still standing in the gravel driveway with his eyes on mine. Still feeling the ghost of his touch on my hand, and I knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that this was far from over.